My dad was a Tuskegee Airman. And so, yeah, so I grew up hearing about them, not paying really close attention. I kick myself now when I was growing up because I had two older brothers and, the military, the war thing, I was such a girly girl. It just didn't really do much for me. So I didn't pay close attention, but I remember, men occasionally coming by the house to see my dad, and those were his war buddies. And as a young journalist, particularly, I remember once I lived in LA, I was working at the LA Daily News, and I was working one Saturday, and the Tuskegee Airmen would have, there was some big air show in Los Angeles. And I had to cover it. And I thought, oh, this could be really fun, Tuskegee Airmen. I remember my dad. And so I always enjoyed covering those things, but I never really said one day, oh, I'm going to write a book about this, right? It didn't happen that way. How this happened was while I was still at the Washington Post, because before I came to NPR in 2019, I spent 22 years at the Washington Post as a Metro reporter, investigative reporter. And it was 2018, and I was one of my colleagues who wrote a lot about history and is very good at it. Actually had done this story about the remains of a World War II pilot that they believe they found in I want to say it was Yugoslavia, and they thought it might have been a Tuskegee Airman. And I thought, wow, I didn't know there were any Tuskegee Airmen who were missing. And so it was an amazing story. It ran on the front page, and I said to my colleague, and he knew my dad was an airman, or I mentioned it somewhere along the way. And I said to him, I said, do you think there are others who are missing? And he says, yeah, there are. And I said, this is your book, because he had done such a great job on the first story. And he said, no, Cheryl, this is your book. And so that's how he planted the seed. They were this country's first Black military pilots who flew in World War II. And there were 355 of them who went to Europe to fight Hitler's army. And they protected the white bomber pilots. And they did a pretty darn good job of doing it too. But they were, they weren't exactly welcomed in Uncle Sam's army. It was in the early 1940s, and racial tensions, the Jim Crow South. It was ugly for them. But they were determined. They were smart. A lot of them were straight out of college. Some of them came straight out of high school. But they were young guys who, loved the fact that they could possibly be the first Black pilots in the military. And they just really wanted to serve their country. I'm not sure they actually thought about the historic aspect of it at the time. They just wanted to do something good. They were patriotic, and they just wanted to do something good for this country. For the most part, most of the men, at least the ones I wrote about, because I really was fortunate enough to talk to several of the remaining airmen at the time, all of whom have since died. So I really am glad that I have them on tape and on video and, whatever. But they didn't know each other, right? There were two pilots who knew each other from college. They went to the same university, and actually they were in the same class. And they just happened to go into the military at the same time, and both of whom were actually lost. But other than that, these were men from all over the country. They came from Texas and Nebraska and Iowa and, various parts of the country. And they ended up being a part of the 332nd Fighter Group, which was commanded by General Benjamin O. Davis Jr., as opposed to Sr. And they, because they were such a small group, they were very close knit because they only had themselves to rely on. And so they became friends and friendly and had each other's backs while they were over in Italy. Whenever someone went missing, the crew that was with them on the missions, they had to file a report. So those existed, right? So I could glean some information as to what happened to them based on those reports. And those reports usually had to be turned in within a day or two of when the pilot disappeared. So that was helpful. All of those people, with the exception of maybe one, have died. They were, they were dead by the time I came around. That was the challenge for me with this book. It's like, oh my God, this was almost 80 years ago. These people are all gone. But there was one witness, or two actually, to pilots who went down who I could talk to, which was really helpful. And they've both since died. But that was really helpful to me because they could give me great detail. They remembered that day. The one thing I learned about these pilots, these amazing pilots, was that they had memories like elephants. The stories they recounted were like as though they happened yesterday. And so they would remember details, and if they would not ask them certain questions, and the memories would come back. And so that was really helpful. But I had to figure out like what was the best way to tell this story. And so I thought, families, right? These men all had families. They had, if they didn't have siblings, they had parents. Some of them had children. And so it was a matter of how am I going to track these people down? How am I going to figure out who was who? And it was just a matter of, the reporter in me kicked in. And I did get the names of the 27. And then I went from there to figure out like, okay, this person, like, sometimes they might have had a common name. And I was like, oh my God, how am I going to find this person? But also the National Archives is just an amazing place to find records. So I hopped on a plane. I did some research and went to St. Louis where they keep the individual, they call it the individual deceased personnel files of these men. And so, of course, the first file that I grabbed was my dad's because I wanted to know, like, did I really know my dad? Like, what am I missing? What didn't I know? And I learned some really interesting things about him. But those files, most of the men had files. In some cases, there wasn't much there because there was a fire in 1973 at the Personnel Center that destroyed millions and millions of records that could never be recreated. So that was a challenge. But for the most part, I would comb through these files and like in one instance, I remember seeing there was a document, it was like a war bond application in this file. And so of course I had the guy's name, but then I was like, okay, like who was his beneficiary or whatever. And so I saw the name of this woman. It was Sarah White. And I thought, oh, is that his wife? And then I looked and it had the Miss by MISS check. So I thought, oh, not the wife, probably a sister. And she was. And so then I knew from the records where he was from because most of the records will tell you where they were from when they were born. And so I tracked her down that way, but it still took a little sleuthing because Sarah White's a common name, but she was from Ohio, and so then I went and searched. I always tell my students, do your secondary sourcing, check to see what's been published before. And so, and I also tell them that journalism is a lot about luck. And trust me, I had a lot of luck when I was researching this book. And so I found an article from a few years ago where some organization had named a street after this lost airman. And it just so happens that there was a Sarah Price who was a Sarah White Price, I think, who was there. And I said, oh, that's must be the sister. So then I called the organization to see if they had a contact number, and they had a contact number for Sarah's daughter. And then I reached out to the daughter. I told her who I was. I had one line whenever I called these people because they don't know me, and they haven't been contacted by a reporter if ever. It's been forever. And so I told them my dad was an airman, and here's who I am. And it turns out that she put me in touch with her mom, who was the surviving sister of this airman. And she took me back to the day when the military police came to tell her that her brother was lost. She was 17 at the time. She was 95 when I tracked her down. And she remembers the day was so vivid. She and her mom were out hanging laundry in the yard, and this car pulled up and the military guys got out and they asked if this was the White family, and she pointed them to her mom, and there were words exchanged, and suddenly the mom just collapsed and the guys caught her before she hit the ground and told her what happened. And Sarah Price, Sarah White Price, was just, she remembered it again. She remembered it like it was yesterday. The funny thing about her was one reason I had a little hard time catching her was because, or figuring out who she was, because she dropped the H from Sarah somewhere along the way. So, you have to take things like that into consideration. But I talked to her a few times. I got pictures. It was just, really good. And then her daughter messaged me last week, and I sent her a copy of the book. I sent all the families copies of the book because I wanted them to have it as sort of a thank you for being so kind to me because they were all so kind to me. And I sent the daughter the book. I told her the book was coming. And a couple days later, she messaged me. 3 days later, she messaged me with her mother's obituary. She died. Sarah died last week at 97. And I said to her daughter, I said, I'm so sorry that your mom didn't get a chance to read her words about her brother. And she said, I showed her the book and she opened her eyes. And then after that, she was gone. So, it's like timing was everything with this book too. Sometimes you have, if you're doing a story or if you're, maybe writing a book that you have more time on, it's like, but I realized that all these people that I was dealing with were elderly. And time was of the essence, and particularly the remaining airmen, they were all close to 100. I thought, I can't wait around. I need to find these people and talk to them and get their stories and, so that's what I did. And it was an amazing journey for me. I mean, I have reports that show, they were trying to do everything they could to sort of sabotage them. So they weren't a priority. And also there was a war going on. In fairness to the government, there was a war going on. And they just didn't there were other things that were more pressing. And sometimes these men went down in enemy territory and it wasn't safe to look for them, but also they did have opportunities. And they lost out on a couple of opportunities to find these men. That I'm certain of. But also, if they did go back, sometimes it was 5, 6, 7 years later, long after the war had ended. And, the question becomes, well, how hard did you really look? I don't know. That's a question for the government. But it wasn't really until 2011 when Josh Frank was a research analyst for the government, and he still is in some capacity. But it was he who decided his job was to try and find missing men, missing personnel, because I'm sure that included women as well, from World War II. He took it upon himself. He's a white guy. He took it upon himself to focus on the Tuskegee Airmen. And that was his role. And that's how he found two of the 27. It was because of Josh and his efforts